Up next, we have Matt Bromiley, a SANS analyst, security researcher, and lead solutions engineer at Lima Charlie. Matt is going to talk about a pain that keeps many of us up at night: leaked credentials falling into the hands of bad actors.
Hi everyone, welcome to our next session, The Path of Least Resistance, Adversary Abuse of Leaked Credentials. My name is Matt Bromiley, and I'm looking forward to sharing this information with you and talking about how this is a significant risk to really any organization that's out there. First, let's talk about our agenda and what we're going to be reviewing in this session today. I'm going to start out by letting you know who I am. We're going to then get into the idea of credential exposure, meaning what is this thing? What does it mean? Why does it matter? And how does it work? We're then going to talk about top risks. And I finally want to finish on business impact, meaning what does this actually mean for your organization and how can we potentially mitigate against these types of attacks as well. First off, my name is Matt Bromiley, and again, thank you for joining me for this session today. I am the lead solutions engineer over at Lima Charlie, a company that builds cybersecurity platforms for organizations. We build really cool stuff. I also work with SANS, the very popular cybersecurity education organization. There I get to write about really cool stuff. I've actually done a lot of work with the folks at Pentera before as well. And then I also serve as a cybersecurity mentor for various different ages and range of career professions. So I teach people how to do really cool things as well. I've got over a decade of experience in information security, ranging from digital forensics and incident response to incident handling, to threat intelligence, to security advising, and all sorts of different roles. So I'm really excited to, again, be bringing this knowledge and sharing my insight with you today on this particular session. And I think you're going to enjoy what we have to talk about as well. All right, let's start with the idea of credential exposure, meaning exactly what is this thing? First off, I want to focus on what I consider to be the most valuable asset that any of your users have. Now think about this one. What is one of the most valuable assets that any of your users have? It's not money. It's not access to money. It's not access to files. It's not the files themselves. It's just simply access. Access is one of the most valuable assets that any of your users have. And there's a couple of things to consider when we talk about the role of access in your organization. Now, we are going to go over some of the risks and things that your organization may suffer as a result of stolen credentials, but I want you to think for a moment about all of the things in your organization tied to user access. Or maybe let's look at it a different way. If I'm a user and I log in to your organization, what can I do when I'm logged in? What types of things can I see? Can I get access to? What types of systems do I have access to? Really, any way I can apply the word access, I'm looking at a valuable asset, but I'm also looking at something that a user account has and may potentially be used against me as well. For this reason, user access is such a valuable asset, and it becomes a very desirable objective for adversaries that are out there. Of course, I would go as far as to say that exposed credentials represent one of the largest risks to any organizations out there today. And I'm really including everyone in this bucket. And I'm doing this for a couple of different reasons. The first is it's sometimes easy to bucket threats into whether or not they apply to my organization, meaning there may be a vulnerability out there for a piece of software that I simply don't use. There may be some sort of potential vulnerability or exposure out there for a third-party service that I just don't have an account with. So there's really a way to kind of write off and say that thing doesn't apply to me. It's a really easy way to mitigate or say we don't even have to deal with this one. But the word access, the concept of access, the concept of leaked or exposed credentials applies to everyone, because in every organization, for any resource, for any user, there's always going to be some form of access, and there's going to be things tied and associated to that access as well. Now, don't let me just be the first one or the only one to tell you about this potential risk. I like to lean very heavily on our Verizon DBIR reports, and I pulled some statistics from the most recent one, the 2022 report. And approximately 82% of breaches surveyed in 2022, which probably occurred in the year before, 2021, involved the human element. Now, the report does a very good job of simplifying the human element as things that involve humans, whether it be a spearfish or some sort of password dump or a data dump that resulted in user compromise, whatever it may have been. They focus on the idea of the human being involved in some form or way of this. Now, of course, obviously the other side of this would be when machines are involved, such as a code vulnerability, a potential vulnerability that has been exploited, or one of those things. Human element is going to focus on something tied to a particular human. There's a beautiful quote, and I say beautiful in a very tongue-in-cheek manner here, because it really is a way to, or a different way, if you will, to think about the types of success that an adversary may have inside of your environment. And that quote is, actions appear innocuous until they attack. And in this line, we have one of the most important words of our entire session today, which is until. And the really tough part to focus on there is that this line hits directly on why access is such a significant risk, because these users appear like users. The actions are innocuous. They are normal. They are normal user behavior until the attack begins. Now, we're going to talk in just a moment about why time is such an important advantage and how credential exposure or credential misuse or leaked credentials ends up taking time away from your security team and time away from your organization. But it's that until part that creates such an important distinction between legitimate accounts and legitimate accounts being used illegitimately. Another key takeaway that I saw in the report that I think adds to our discussion today is just how much credentials have grown as a potential vector in breaches. Now, this is a great graph, and I love the way that it kind of paints the idea of credentials against personal information, against payment information. And I think not only does it highlight what adversaries are going after, but it also highlights that credentials are something that can be quickly turned into an entry vector or quickly misused against an organization. And take a look at the growth rate that we've got here. Watch from 2017 to 2021 how credentials go from a sub 20% item all the way up to higher than 50%, actually in the year 2020 being higher than personal information and coming out at a very close tie in last year's data. Now, of course, I want to ask everyone, what do you think when you see this graph? When you see this type of growth, when you see this type of change, what do you think that's showing us? What do you think the story behind that is from an adversary perspective? And I think it's pretty straightforward. Adversaries are telling us where they find the most value. Watching the types of data that adversaries will go after year after year, breach after breach, intrusion after intrusion, shows us where they're finding value. And when I start to see data types fall off or statistically dip down, or when I see data types go much stronger or hold steady, we're getting an idea year over year of where adversaries are placing their priorities. And for sure, it's credentials. We see it time and time again. We see it in the form of credentials. The report proves to us, and the statistics prove to us, that this is a thing that adversaries continue to go after. Now, let's delve into some risks and talk a little bit about how credential exposure has some additional things for organizations to consider. The first thing I want to focus on when we talk about credential exposure risks is the types of credential exposure that you'll see out there. The first type that I wanted to pick on and focus on for this session is the idea of common or default accounts. Now, there's a couple of different categories here for consideration. The first is being kind of common shared accounts. This is a very unique concept that I wouldn't expect to see in a lot of organizations, but unfortunately we do, where we've got common accounts that are used by many employees. And this may be for something such as a third-party service, a login for a remote access tool. It may be some sort of, not really a critical service, if you will, but it is something that has one account, one username, one password, and gets shared amongst multiple employees or multiple users. The issue with this is that I now have multiple users responsible for one set of credentials. Only one of them may actually use or lose those credentials. However, now everyone is impacted by that. This creates a one-to-many threat relationship. One exposed account impacts many victims, and it's really not an ideal place to be. I've also thrown into this category the idea of default credentials. I think default credentials are borderline credential exposure. Looking up a credential or a default set of credentials inside of a user manual and then throwing those against some sort of application or access control is not an uncommon attacker technique, but I would go as far as to say those aren't really exposed or leaked. They're just a misconfiguration, but the risks are the same. They grant access to a party that otherwise would not have access. The second one we're going to look at is the idea of shared passwords. Now, this is a little bit different than users sharing an account. This is users having their own accounts, having their own passwords. However, we get now into the human side of trying to maintain information security. And this is where users, in the attempts to maintain as many unique passwords as they can, will often come up with a strong password, memorize that particular password, and share that password between sites. This amplifies the risk of stolen or leaked credentials for one obvious reason. I may never be aware of where a password actually came from. If I've got a user who utilizes the same password across multiple different sites, that user can one day show up. Now, we'll talk about where that password may be garnered from, but the risk there is very, very real because the idea of sharing passwords between sites is something we see commonly all the time. The third type of credential exposure that I want to get into is third-party accounts. And third-party accounts is exactly what it sounds like. This is where I've got a third-party organization or a third-party service that has access into my organization. This goes beyond what I would consider a typical user from a security perspective, because I can't wrap the same type of monitoring, the same type of concern, the same types of tooling around these particular users until they reach my door, until they reach my perimeter. And that's the important distinction between the two. Users who are inside my environment, I can keep tabs on. I can wrap them behind security software. I can deploy all sorts of things to keep an eye on them. Users that come from third parties, I can't wrap the same protections around again until they show up at the door. Now, let's get into sources for this because it's important to understand, now that I know the types of credential exposure or the most popular types of credential exposure, where do these come from? Where do my adversaries source them from? First one is really straightforward, phishing. We need credentials, we go steal them. Now, phishing may be the first vector or the first thing that an adversary attempts. It may be the last one. But the problem is that phishing can lead to a plethora of attacks, and many times we see nearly every category of attack out there, whether it's a long-term APT campaign or a short robbery, smash and grab ransomware attack. Phishing is involved a lot of times. They can lead to a plethora of different different types of attacks. Another very, very common source is data dumps. This may include things like paste sites or dark web sales and things like that. This is where our adversaries will, as either the focus or the byproduct of another intrusion, come across a set of usernames and passwords, and they may sell these, they may offer them for free, they may just dump them out on the dark web or dump them out on a paste site and say, here's some credentials, go for it, have fun. The third type that we might talk about here are code repositories. And this is not so much an illegitimate source, if you will. These are instead credentials that have inadvertently been uploaded to some sort of code repository, such as a GitHub or a GitLab. And these may include things like username and password combos or API keys or other types of access mechanisms. The problem here is that changes made to public repositories are still public and they're still available in the history. They're still available in that commit history and may be something that someone could get access to. An inadvertent mistake, if pushed to a public repository, might not be as easy to remove. Let's get into the idea of risks. Now, knowing where credentials may come from and knowing the types of credentials that I might lose, how exactly can these things be used against me? That's what our risks will focus on. The first one is the word access, the concept of legitimate access, exactly what started our session off today. The idea of legitimate access goes really against what a lot of security tooling and security teams are designed for. Most security detection and analysis focus on abnormalities, the things that don't fit inside of the environment. Users fit. Users should have access, and they should be using that access. If I said to you a user logged in to the corporate website or logged into an organization, that should raise no red flags. Adversaries know this, and they want to hide under that layer of trust. The other one is what I'm calling open sesame, which is if I have valid credentials into your environment, what else do I have access to? Can I take advantage of single sign-on or Active Directory integration? Can my credentials be used at a third-party site? My credentials might open more doors than my security team actually has monitoring around. And last but not least, I think this also creates the risk of less to detect. We go back to our earlier quote, which is that adversaries appear innocuous until the attack actually starts. And this unfortunately creates less opportunity for detection because, as I said just a moment ago, users fit. They should be in here. Credentials that go even further and might have elevated access or the right access, depending on adversary objectives, might leave much less detectable noise. And there's a lot of times, and unfortunately a lot of cases, where it might be too late to discover illegitimate activity before the attack has actually started. And that is exactly what our adversaries are hoping. They are hoping that they can blend in for as long as they possibly can. Now, all of this focuses on risks and the types of things I would expect to see. But I also want to spend a moment and I want to talk about business impact. Meaning, what does this do to my organization? Is it just my users who are impacted by this, or can my entire organization, can my business suffer from this? And the answer is the latter, of course. First off, business impacts at an access level. Simply put, there's a stranger in your house. Someone who does not belong there is there. They have access, unfettered access, untamed, unknown access. The second type of business impact, I think, comes from data. Not only is a stranger in the house, but they have access to data and resources that are often governed by account usage. Detection becomes very difficult. Can a security team keep up with every single stolen account that's out there? Can we possibly expect to be monitoring all of these things? Exposed credentials can open attack vectors that may have otherwise been closed or may have otherwise been written off or decided to be not applicable to our organization. And the final business impact, the one that I think hits the hardest, is trust. And if I take the previous four and sum them all up, it really boils down to, well, what is safe and what is not? Because I may have one of the most forward-thinking security device or security stacks or security apparatuses ever. But if someone has legitimate access to the organization that I'm supposed to protect, well, am I looking for that? Am I looking for legitimate access being abused? But furthermore, how does my business suffer when that much of the organization has been exposed and my security team didn't know about it? And this also gets wrapped up in the concept of time. My security team might find out about an attack after the attack has started, but how long did that user maintain access for? Just how long did that user have access into our environment? What else did they see? What other types of things were uncovered? What other types of things were observed, potentially exfiltrated, potentially removed? And let's go a step further. Do I, as a security team or as a business, even have a way to quantify just what that time frame may have looked like? The scary thing about this is that it can happen to any organization that's out there, but there are steps that can be taken to help mitigate this, or what I'm calling increase resistance to that path of least resistance. The first one is really simple and straightforward: multi-factor authentication. Prove you're you. I'm going to implement some other technological mechanism that I can use to prove that you are who you say you are. It may be something as simple as a code that is sent out. It may be a key. It may be some sort of FIDO device. It may be some sort of 2-factor, 3-factor, whatever it might be, that actually says you are who you say you are. I won't say MFA is never bypassed, because we do know that there are attacks that can bypass MFA, and plenty of adversaries have had success doing that. But I'll go another route and I'll say my goal in mitigation is to lower my percentage of risk. And MFA certainly can help do that. The second one is going to be user education, but I should have put it first. Not that I didn't want to change it around, but user education is such a critical concept for any sort of defense that you might try to implement. Users are your front line, not your tools. Educate them about the risks. Third option here from a mitigation perspective is going to be to switch things up. What other credential types are available? Can I utilize cryptographic key pairs? Can I utilize some other form of physical security key? What other types are out there? Fourth, single serve. Don't reuse credentials, period. That's it. Talk to your users, again, user education, but perform some audits in your environment to make sure it's not happening. And last but not least, offload. Make passwords difficult to crack. Utilize something like a password manager to help make life a little bit easier. Utilize some sort of technology to help you maintain strong passwords and keep them unique. The goal of increasing awareness or increasing resistance is to maintain awareness of stolen or leaked credentials, test them against your systems and found, and understand the risk that leaked credentials and implant procedures for mitigating this process. Finally, don't forget, your users are your front line. Your users are the ones who help defend your organization because they're the ones most at risk. Do everything you can to protect them. Huge thank you to everyone for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this session. It was quick, it was brief, but we got a lot covered. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time to bring the 2023 Exposure Summit to a close. From risk reduction to exposure management, today's summit has provided a comprehensive insight into the field. All of today's sessions will be made available for you within 24 hours, so feel free to come back and view the sessions as needed. On behalf of the Pentera team, we hope that you've enjoyed your time with us today and received useful information and practices from our expert speakers. Finally, if you are interested in attending future exposure summits, be sure to follow Pentera on LinkedIn to get updates about our next events. Stay cyber safe, and thank you for joining us for the 2023 Exposure Summit.